Hi, and welcome to Dip In and Out with Lucy, the podcast that opens up the discussion around domestic abuse. I'm very fortunate this morning to be sitting down with Dr Aysha Ahmed. She is founder and director of Aasha Consulting, but she is so much more than that. And if I started to say it all, I think we'd be here all day. So I think it's better to hand over to Dr Aysha and she can explain a lot more about what she does. Good morning.
Good morning, Lucy, and thank you so much for inviting me to your podcast and talking about my work. Really appreciate that.
Thank you.
So, just to introduce myself, I am Dr. Aysha Ahmed. I'm by profession a children and family social work professional, and I've been in social work for over 35 years. Actually, recently was my work anniversary, so it was quite reassuring that I'm still here. Um, but apart from being a social worker, I do have a number of other hats that I wear. And one of those is that I have completed research into domestic violence for Bangladeshi women. But I work with a lot of South Asian communities working around domestic violence research, awareness raising, and also uh, I am now a founder and director of Aasha Consultancy. Now, there's a confusion between Aisha and Aasha, and I'll explain a little bit about what Aasha is. I mean, Aasha means in Bengali hope. And when I finished my research, I wanted to do some work around, restoring hope in terms of working around domestic violence and then women being able to talk about their experiences. So I suppose Asha's aim is to look at continued raising awareness of domestic violence within the South Asian community. My focus is particularly the Bangladeshi community in the UK. I also provide lots of trainings to professionals and also hoping to begin to work with sort of organizations in relation to awareness raising, the differences in experiences of South Asian women, which is vital, I think, and also to look at providing guidance, advice, expertise that I've gained over the years that I've worked as a social worker and throughout my research. So I know that's a long introduction, but that's what I am doing at the moment.
Listen, you can only say what is true, and that's all very true. So, and it's what I think amazed me when I met you is when I worked for the charity I worked for, it became so obvious, those additional challenges, those additional barriers that those from, the Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities, that the additional challenges they face in terms of language barriers, in terms of all the other things, cultural considerations that go on. And it isn't discussed enough. We have this preconceived idea of what domestic abuse looks like within different cultures. And actually, we don't really understand it at all. And we need people like yourself who've worked in those areas and say, actually, this is what it's like, and this is what we can do to change things. And I know when we spoke previously, I love the name Aasha Consulting because everything I tag on LinkedIn or whatever I'm doing, it's always about hope. Because I think for some people who have experienced abuse and violence, it may be all you've got left. That last little spark of hope might be all you have. But I always think as long as you have hope, then there is always a chance of moving forward, being happy, which is what we all want at the end of the day, isn't it, really?
Yeah. And I think it's quite intentionally named because I think, as you said, it's absolutely that in a moment of despair, people kind of lose that hope. And it's really hard for women, particularly in the South Asian communities, to be able to say, I'm not the only one who's experiencing abuse.
Yeah.
Because often people tend not to talk about abuse because they feel they're the only one and it must be something that they've done or they've kind of it's created from that. And I think, like you said, hope is something that my participant in my research really highlighted and talked about. And I thought it was really pivotal to the work I do as well, because if there isn't hope, then there is no change.
No.
And lots of these women that I've sort of interviewed for my research talked about faith and hope, and that's where the name Asha actually comes from. I mean, Asha Consulting is it is in its infancy still, because I've finished my research and I kind of started talking to people like yourself and other people, and provided some training around. And because of the area that I'm looking at, I know people really do want to learn a lot more, and I thought that was the best way to actually start talking about the differences in experiences women have from different communities, also different faith groups, because I think there is a lot of misconception around Islam, for example, and all the women that I spoke to are Muslim. They identify themselves as someone from the Islamic communities, and they don't want to talk about that. They don't want to
Mm.
talk about their religion, purely because there is a huge negative connotation attached to Islam in the wider society. And I think women feel that if we talk about, we are religious, then we are going to be boxed in either, it happens in Muslim communities, it happens in, South Asian household, and also that, your men, if you like, are extremists. And so therefore that there is a lot of layers to women, why they restrict themselves. And I think it would be really important to talk about the barriers women face before they come into talking about their experiences of domestic violence.
Yeah.
That is often within an Eurocentric framework, if you like, is often missed.
Mm.
And I suppose my research, which is apparently now available, I'm still waiting for my link, but it actually deals with that quite at length in relation to how women find strength in religion.
Yeah.
I've recently completed, and it's published, a research with SOAS, the University of London, that looks at different communities, including Asian community, as well as the African Ethiopian communities. And it's quite striking the similarities of Christianity and Islam, which we never talk about,
No.
how women kind of um, look at God, punishment,
Yeah.
despair. And but the difficulty is when you start talking about South Asian community or Bangladeshi community or Muslim community, there is this barrier.
Yeah.
And women feel that I spoke to feel that that limits them and restricts them in their disclosures, being one of the barriers. I wouldn't say that that's all the barriers, but it's one of the barriers that prevent women talking about domestic violence.
Yeah. Oh God, I couldn't agree with you more. Absolutely. And it's interesting, I think it's difficult when we start, we talk about religion or we talk, people tend to either switch off because
Yeah.
they don't want to know or they don't understand and think it's not for me. And I remember saying a few years ago that within different religions, it doesn't matter in terms of what the religion is in some respects because there will be the same problems, i.e., just as an example, it made me think about, say, Roman Catholics. And in that respect, if you're Roman Catholic and you're experiencing abuse and you want to leave that relationship, you'll bring shame on your family because Roman Catholics don't believe in divorce. Divorce is not, it's an absolute no-no. Now, obviously, there's ways in terms of annulment, etc. But there is that link, isn't there, I think? But then there's obviously, especially for those within BAME community with South Asian, as you say, there's those extra barriers in terms of language, in terms of, like you say, even talking about it and admitting that you have a faith, that in itself must be so, so difficult.
It's absolutely difficult, but I think also faith is an area that everybody avoids. And whether you're a professional, if you're talking to a professional and they're talking about specific faith, they don't want to be seen as discriminating somebody or being discriminatory towards that community or towards that person. There is this sense of being oversensitive, I call
Mm.
it, because I think there is a fear of if it's a white British person talking to a South Asian community, they don't want to be seen to be racist.
Yeah,
And I'm saying it as it is because often we kind of walk around it.
yeah,
And then what happens is that women are the people who are sort of, they don't get the support that they need
Yeah.
or they want. In relation to sort of talking about language, my research, apart from I think two of the women, they are British born women who've been educated in this country. They're not the as a stereotypical perception of who should be a victim. They don't fit that bill. They are women who worked, who are professionals, who kind of have an well-established independence. So that therefore, I think it's really important to say that domestic violence affects everybody. It doesn't discriminate against religion. It doesn't discriminate against communities or, your status or your profession. But that was the sort of myth that I felt I wanted to break, that this isn't just about women who don't speak English or who came from a different country to settle here. Domestic violence can be anybody, and it really doesn't matter about your race or your religion. And that I suppose the only thing I wanted to highlight is that women from Bangladeshi community or South Asian community have an added layer because there are different intersection for these women, that it actually is very difficult for people outside to understand why women are so reluctant to be able to talk about or even come to receive services. And that intersectionality is the area that I think my research really deals with, but it is so under-researched and under-talked about that it actually alienates some of the women who really need the support services. And I call it, sort of barrier to disclosure, because the barrier to disclosure is really difficult for people to understand. One of the things I would say is that, as I found, part of my research finding is that it's not that women don't want to speak. They do. They want to share their experiences. They want to be able to get the support that they need. It's about who they speak to and who understands them.
Yeah.
And I suppose from a point of different professionals, it's always been issues of safety first. And that's absolutely right. I work with within the children and family support system, and we do look at safeguarding for children. And I think lots of the women that I spoke to said that professionals don't understand that they would have been safeguarding their children long time before professional started to work with the women and children. And when people start working with them, that is often discounted. And the focus is very much on safeguarding right now. The other thing about, and you touched on it, Lucy, is about, shame and honor and dishonor. I talk about women who said, we all talk about community shame, family shame. Nobody talks about self-shame.
Yeah.
And that was quite deep for me, because I think everybody who works within the communities talk about, if you do this, it will dishonor your family. If you do this, this will dishonor your community. And your faith says you shouldn't be sort of talking about your community outside or your family outside. The women very strongly spoke about, what about my self-shame? How do I say to my children, I'm being abused?
Yeah.
And it's embarrassing for me, it's shameful for me. How do I go to my siblings and say that? And for someone to understand that, it is really deep, and it's very sort of it's very different to the wider community of women experiencing domestic violence, in the sense that they're talking about shame within their own families. And Bangladeshi family do tend to live in multi-generational homes. I mean, it's lessened
Yeah.
nowadays because of obviously evolving of communities. But there are elements of, you'll have multi-generation homes where women will talk about, how am I going to say this? Because it's shameful for me. Self-blame is evident in women who experience domestic violence in a wider context. But lots of the Bangladeshi women take on self-blame really, really onto themselves, saying that they must have been the cause of the violence, or they must have been the instigator of something that they've done.
Mm.
And it's been really hard during my research to talk to women, to say, well, actually, there is no profile of someone who's been a victim of domestic violence.
Yeah.
And I think often what happens is that understanding that layer of intersectionality for Bangladeshi women is very difficult for someone who's working with them that may not know the cultural context to family and extended family.
Yeah, God, you've touched on so many points there. I don't think I'll be able to cover them all. But honestly, it's this is I'm just so happy that we're doing this episode. To me,
Oh,
it's so important. It really is so. I can't stress how important it is. And I think this is what, when we talk about the similarities in terms of the wider aspects of abuse, that shame, that blame, like you say, yes, we all sort of think of the shame and blame culture of somebody who is from a minority community as being about their family, about the culture, about the community and the shame there. But just as anybody else who is a domestic abuse victim or survivor, it's that self-blame and that self-shame that it doesn't discriminate. It doesn't matter who you are. That is sadly the product of the abuse is as a human being, and we're all human beings, is when you have experienced something like that, you will feel that shame, and it doesn't help when society and even our family and friends will say, well, why didn't you do something? Why did we know the classic is why didn't you just leave? Why
yeah.
didn't? And it's always that I always say it's the onus is constantly being put back on the victim, on the survivor. It's down to you. Actually, it's down to us as society. If we're going to say we want to work with people, we want to help people, we need to be more aware of all those sensitivities, of all those things that we should be more understanding that it isn't that straightforward as just saying, well, you just need to speak out. You're 100% right in everything you've just said. You've covered so much there. And it's like you say, that multi-generational aspect as well. And trying to access support and trying to find people who understand. Um, I think one of the biggest things as well is if you don't understand it yourself, because maybe I often say this is if something has become your normal, how can you then try and describe to somebody? And I did a post recently about this, about, using, what tea bags you use, how you have your hair or whatever it may be. And, that understanding that that's how deep abuse goes, that's how deep control goes, that somebody will control your everything you're doing. And if that to you is normal, how do you then break that? And if you've got family and people around you saying, well, that's how it is, deal with it, then that person is so trapped.
And I suppose for most communities, accepting abuse is a massive thing,
Yeah,
because accepting abuse means you've got to do something about it,
yeah,
or you would want to do something about it. Within the women that I spoke to, at the initial stages when I started my interviews with them, we were talking about what I was kind of sitting back thinking, well, this is really severe coercive controls.
mm,
But the women wouldn't accept it. They would say, well, it happens in marriages, he
yeah,
gets angry, he'll calm down. It didn't happen in front of the children, which are the classics sort
yeah,
of research information we already know. But added to that was also the issue of forgiveness.
mm,
Women talked about forgiving their perpetrators because they'll always have an excuse because he's done it for this or this reason, and that it's more rewarding to forgive in the eyes of Allah, and that if you forgive and you try and make it work, then it is rewarding for you. But also, they didn't understand that what they were experiencing was abuse,
mm,
because, as you say, it's also how women and girls have been raised in many ways to say, you make compromises, you adjust in marriages, and we all do. As married women, we all adjust to our marriages. But it was difficult to sort of say when the sort of control becomes abusive.
yeah,
And women will not talk about, I was abused until they kind of reflected and kind of were at a point where they could see the impact of the abuse that they're experiencing on their children.
Yes.
And that was a trigger for lots of the women to actually then talk about their experiences and trying to protect their children. The added layer, I suppose, you've touched on is why don't women just leave? Well, with Bangladeshi women or South Asian women, it isn't just about you leave. We know from research that women who were murdered were often murdered 6 months after they left their abusive relationship. Within the Bangladeshi community, the added layer is children. You
Mm.
know, what would happen to my child? So the women go into the thinking of the future of their child and what will happen if they became somebody who's a single mom. That's a significant stigma.
Yeah.
The other bit about marriage and divorce, and I really extensively talked about, is that, yes, of course, like many communities, divorce is a stigma, and nobody wants to do that if they can remain in a marriage. Also, religiously, if they went to a religious establishment, the first thing they will want to do is try and see if your marriage can be saved, because marriage and, sorry, divorce should be a last resort for
Yeah.
communities, like, for example, like the Catholic communities, equally the Muslim and the Christian communities.
Mm.
So it's not just that Muslim people don't allow them to divorce. Um, but then I suppose the other flip bit is, what are you offering women who do want to leave?
Mhm.
Because I've had women that I worked with where they've gone, they've left, they are put in a place that culturally, religiously, linguistically does not meet their needs.
Yeah.
They have children. They are pretty much dependent on financial support from either their partners or their families. And when they have been removed, that they found all these barriers were so significant that women decided to return
Yeah.
because they're not, the support system isn't there.
Mm.
The added problem, I suppose, as well, is the kind of services they receive from different service providers. For example, women will not call the police.
Mm.
On average, I think women that research identifies like about 35, 40 times before they will actually call the police.
Mm.
So you've got to put it in context that if a woman has called the police on the other end of it,
Yeah.
what support is she getting?
She gets.
So
Yeah.
therefore, I recently read about, police handling calls about domestic violence. It's a welcome kind of significant development. But for lots of the South Asian Bangladeshi women, what they find is that what they've talked about that they find is that there is this dismissive approach to say, well, speak to your family, speak to your community. And so there is a lot of discrimination, a lot of stereotyping that happens. Lots of racial discrimination women face, which means that if they've approached a service and they've experienced that, they will not go and approach another support service.
Yeah.
And that limits and creates an added barrier for the women
Yeah.
that often, we talk about, but when you live that experience, then it's very difficult for women to just up and go.
Yeah. Definitely.
The other aspect is that the women don't always want to go. What they want to do is they
That
want
doesn't
to
get talked
stay and
about
be
enough.
safe.
Yeah.
Because if they go, they lose that support network of the community, the schools. Some of the women that I spoke to, schools were really supportive. That also provided them that relief when they were
Yes.
experiencing abuse, that they would take the children, they'll be able to speak to someone. When they go away from the area or the locality, all that support stops. I mean, there are serious issues and safeguarding where women do understand that they have to go
Mm.
and they're willing to. But I think we talk about buy and for services, and at this moment in time, they are very far and scarce everywhere across the country. And it depends where you're talking, who you're talking to about what level of service women are receiving.
Mm.
And for someone to talk about that, I think is really hard because
Yeah.
people are often discouraged not to talk about lack of resources.
Yeah.
And I suppose that's where the awareness issues arise from what I do, not only for the women and community, but also for professionals. And I think my heart is also into terms of trying to educate professionals about the intersectionality of women, the layers of the responsibility these women have.
Mm.
And once they've come out to report and seek support, what should they do? What should professionals do to
Yeah.
gain that trust?
Definitely. And again, it's you you touch on so many things, you really do. And I think this is going to be so important for people to hear. And what the things you're talking about that just don't get discussed. And I think when, in particular, if we're talking about female victims and survivors, a huge, huge fear for them is what will happen to my children? There's so much in the media, there's so much goes on. And I know, again, having worked in a domestic abuse charity myself, when you're talking to people from these communities, they're so fearful that the children are going to be taken away from them. And and it's terrifying because they've seen so many things going on, and they've probably been scared into it, which, by whoever is the abuser, whoever it may be, saying, well, you know what, if you leave, this will happen. You've also just touched on the fact that it is, sadly, the victim survivor is usually the one that has to leave the community, and
Mm,
not just the
mm,
community, but the area. So the abuser stays within the area and
mm,
has their support network around them. But the victim survived with children is the one that has to move away, which to me just seems, and we understand the reasons, like you say, safeguarding, etc. But there's so many layers to it, like you
mm.
say, and if we're there and we're trying to help and support people, we need to understand all these things that are going on behind the scenes. And again, you've touched on the fact that, and I've said this before, and people look at me like I'm crazy when I say some people don't want to leave. And I have
No.
dealt with people who said, I actually want to, but I want to stay safe in the situation I'm in. And I think it's so important that as a society, as professionals, that people need to understand that it's not our place to judge. As much as you want to say you want to get that person out of that situation, the more good you can do is by helping them in the best way possible, as opposed to saying, look, you need to get out. This is, you need to build that trust and say, okay, so what can we do to support you? And like you say, it may be talking to the school, it may be having that connection there and that support network. But we are in no position to judge. And God, you just touched on so many.
I'm sorry.
No,
It's
it's
just that I'm
brilliant.
I'm absolutely if I start talking about abuse against women, it's something I've worked with for so long, and I just feel that there's so much to share with people so that they understand how to better support these women who themselves have probably, came to a point where they've started to talk. And then we as professionals add lots of barriers, and then they sort of move away from that. And I think, look, as external professionals, it is hard to understand. I mean, as a woman of Bangladeshi origin, brought up in this country, I went to do my research thinking, okay, everybody's going to talk to me, I speak the same language, there shouldn't be a problem.
Mm.
And what was really eye-opener for me is that even I thought I'm an insider, I belong in the community, that
Yeah.
would be really easy. What I found was it was absolutely not that, because because of the added layers, I'm from someone of a professional background where I work in child protection.
Mm.
Now, instantly you talked about women's fear. That fear isn't just for Bangladeshi women or South Asian women. Lots of women talk about, if I say something, my children will be removed from me.
Yeah.
And that fear is real. And, there are times when children have been removed because of lots of difficulties, not solely because it was just violence towards their mother, but that was one of the contributing factors. But the fear that women also have in South Asian communities is not the immediate fear right now about their children. They talk about the future of their children.
Yeah.
The marriage prospects, if you're a single mother, how would that sort of be seen within the wider society and community? And those layers of complexity adds to the abuse they experience and continue to experience. Even then, they feel that if they stay within where they are, the support system is much better,
Yeah.
and they want to work with that. The issue that I've also discussed is that lots of the women who experience domestic violence experience loss of control,
Mm.
loss of power. And somebody coming in and suddenly making a decision and say, well, you have to now leave everything, and the perpetrator remains in the house or remains in the area, is a significant control taken away from them.
Yeah.
And their decision-making capacity is then further reduced. And I think that's an area that we are, as professionals, really focused on safety, which is absolutely right.
Yeah.
But we also need to involve the women concerned and to say what is, firstly, take on what strategies they've already have in place to safeguard, and to build on that to be able to remain in the community so that they don't face the added barriers like discrimination, like social isolation, like racial kind of experiences that they do when they do move to areas that they don't know, they don't have any connections or networking.
Yeah.
And that's really, really important for people working with those communities, particularly when you are assessing someone's health and safety and risks
Yeah.
to the women and children. So, yeah.
Yeah, and that's, it's because the mental health kind of the implications there, like you just said it. If you've been so immersed in your family, in your community, and then people are deciding, well, actually, the best thing for you to do is move away, but you're
Mm,
taking away that network of people that have become, everything. And that impact on the emotional well-being, on the mental health, not just of the victims, but the children as well. Um, and like you say, into areas where we need to be more understanding of cultures, we need to be more understanding of all these other things that are going on behind the scenes. And the sad thing is, if those who are obviously, as like I keep going back to being human beings, if we could sit there and have that conversation like we're doing now, how much more understanding would there be in that respect? And it comes down to respect, doesn't it? It comes down to respect of each other's values, um, each other's heritage, each other's everything. It comes down to all of it. And if we all did more of this and tried to understand, as opposed to just turning the blinkers on, going, well, it's not my problem, I don't know, we'll just do X, Y, and Z. No, we need to be. We would solve so many problems if we just took the time, and it's just taking time to find out more, to understand more. And we could learn so much more. That's the thing, learn so much more. But it's taking time, and I think that's where the problems lie in terms of funding, in terms of, there's so much that needs to change. For us to be able to support people in the way that they need to be supported. Not, you touched on that as well. It's not just about how, as professionals or as councils or as the government, how they think people need support. It's actually, well, let's take into consideration what that person feels their needs are. They know themselves better than anybody else, and yes, it may take time to find themselves again after all they've experienced, but it's still there because there's still hope. And that goes back to what we were saying at the beginning. It's a lovely full circle that if we
mm.
give people the respect to have that conversation, um, the world would be a very different place, I think.
Lucy, you summarized it so well. And I think, added to that is also about being honest to say, I don't know. I
Yes.
don't know about this culture, rather than making assumptions and say, it happens in your community, it happens in your family. If you are not someone who's aware of the South Asian community's cultural heritage or religious practices, speak to people who know. Don't make assumptions about, this happens, because that in itself is stereotyping people into a corner, which then disempowers women, because they see that disrespect, they see that dishonesty. And I think if you, in any profession, if women sort of are asked, like you said, or if people are not clear about something, to go and speak to someone who knows, who would be able to guide them, support them, it would be a better place, and it would be a more respectful place for women. And I think, this may encourage other women to talk about it. just to sort of come back onto Hope and Asha, my aim is to highlight the women who spoke. Um, the research was done during COVID, and obviously COVID-19 and the restrictions had meant that there was time when I thought, God, am I going to ever be able to do this and do justice to the women's voices?
Mm.
And one of the things I've called my research is finding our voices, because our voices as women from minority communities doesn't matter whether you're a professional or a sort of survivor of an abuse, it is very limited. And
Mm.
I'm choosing my word carefully here. It is limited in the sense that you have to be doubly hardworking to be able to come and speak about women's experiences. As a professional, you have to be sort of doing the work very much over and above to be able to then go and talk about it.
Mm.
Yes, of course, lack of funding is a huge issue. I do want to say the work I'm doing is all self-funding still. And it's because I just feel I can't wait for funding to be able to
Yeah.
talk about the experiences women are having. It's already late. We need to talk about it. We need to get that support out there. So lots of the work I do is on my own. And I feel that by doing that, I'm at least giving the women who spoke to me a voice,
Mhm.
that their experiences are being talked about. The other thing I also feel is really crucial is to go back to the universities and talk about this as to the kind of the new professionals coming out. I feel that's crucial in the sense that if you don't hear about this from the time you are entering a profession, you're already entering a profession with prejudged ideas.
Yeah.
And so, therefore, I do a lot of teaching around my research so that people can understand the differences of experiences women have. You know, as a white woman, someone experiencing domestic violence will experience it very differently to somebody who's from Pakistani background or a Bangladeshi background. And one of the question I had from one of the students recently was, what's the difference? And I said, there is my answer.
Mm.
If you're not experiencing or understanding what is the difference, you don't have to be from that community or that culture. You just need to be aware
Where?
and be culturally competent to be able to ask the right questions, or to be able to go and say, I'm sorry, I don't know about your culture. I'm going to find out and I'm going to come back.
Absolutely.
And once we've got to that point, we're at least one step on the ladder, I think.
Oh my God, yes. And you've just made me think again, I'm thinking about universities, I'm thinking about all those different professionals who will come out of university. This is something that's such a widespread issue that why aren't we talking about it in education, all in age appropriate ways? But
Mm,
why aren't
mm.
we educating people? Yes, it's okay that we have certain things that go on within colleges around healthy relationships, but we need to go so much further than that. That's just like skimming the top of the iceberg. And you've just made me think of something. And I do remember going out to one individual a few years ago. And when I arrived they were in housing at this point. And when I arrived, she asked me, did I mind taking my shoes off at the door? I was like, absolutely no problem. Not a problem at all. Went in, and she was in the process of trying to get herself sorted, and lots had been going on. And she said, I'm so sorry, there's nowhere for you to sit. I said, I'll sit on the floor. I don't mind. I'm absolutely fine. She went, well, there's there, you can sit on, she'd literally just sort of made a bed up, that kind of thing, there's a chair there. And I think if we were all just, she clearly was going through so much. On top of all that, she's got somebody coming in, talking to her, asking her what her experiences have been like from different services. Or it's the very least we can do is be respectful of somebody else's cultures, communities, and say, absolutely, that is no problem. And because of that, she opened up so much more because she knew there was a mutual respect. And I think that possibly is one of my proudest moments, is knowing that she wanted to talk because she felt respected and she felt understood. And
Mm.
yeah, it was very, very, very important.
And just to echo that, we in whether you're in social care profession or any other profession or even in research, we say women don't want to talk. Bangladeshi women don't want, they do want to
They
talk.
do.
And I think, as I've said earlier, they want to talk so that they know you're listening. They know that you're respecting, and then they know that there is something that's going to be done about the information that they've shared. And I think that was the driver for me to be able to finish this project, to say, I can't have the women's voices sit on a piece of paper.
Yeah. Yeah.
They've trusted me. They've come. They obviously had to have lots of battles within themselves.
To do it.
Also, the courage to come and speak to someone who's from the same community. And it really does need to be shared
Mm.
on a wider scale. And one of the things I've done is, as I was doing the research, was to share it in an international conference where I felt that there were other similarities other researchers have brought
Mm.
to talk about. And that in itself kind of gave me the strength, if you like, to say, well, that people do want to know.
Yeah.
And I have a role that I can help people to understand the experiences the women are having, um, and be their voice.
Yeah.
Even though it's a small voice, at least it's a voice that women have from this community.
Listen, I
And
think your voice is a voice echoing in the darkness, and that's what we need.
thank
100%.
you. Thank you.
No, you are incredible. And I think what I love about what you're doing is you simplify it in the right way. You don't overcomplicate it. You don't make it kind of, because for lots of people it might be, well, I don't understand, so therefore, we fear what we don't understand. We hear that saying so often, but you simplify it to the extent that the way you talk about it, the passion you have, it comes out of you, it shines out of you. It's so obvious, and the way you talk about it makes me more passionate, to learn more myself, because I don't understand everything. I think a lot of people sometimes think when you work around EA, you know everything, and we
Mm,
don't. We really don't, and we're always learning. We're always finding new things that are going on within the domestic abuse world, if you like. And there is so much good being done, but there's so much more that we can be
yeah,
doing. There's so much further to go. But with conversations like this, 10 years ago, can you imagine us sitting here together having this conversation? It just wouldn't have happened. I remember thinking, starting a podcast, somebody said to me, if you'd have said you were doing this years ago and talking about post-separation abuse and all the rest, no one would be listening. But I took hope in the fact that, we've changed our stance on mental health awareness. Well, now we
mm,
need to start changing our stance on domestic abuse awareness. They sound like scary words, but when you break it down and you start to talk to people, we can help those that we may not even realize are experiencing. It could be family, friends, work colleagues. It doesn't matter. Like you said before, it doesn't discriminate. And what you do is just so invaluable. It really is.
thank you.
Oh,
Thank you.
I can't thank you enough. And I know I said to you we could talk all morning, and I know we could. But I would love it if at some point in the future you come back and we have a catch up on how things are going, and hopefully positive, wonderful developments. You've been doing so much already, but yeah, it's
Yeah,
important that we can't stop the conversation. We have to keep that conversation going, because the more we do, the more, chances we have of helping even a handful of people. That's what I told myself at the beginning of all this, and that seems to be the case, and it's helping more and more people. So we just keep going.
yeah, yeah. Thank you. I mean, like I said, it's something that I've been working on for a very long time, and there are pockets of improvements, and there's no denying in that. But there is a lot to be done, a lot to talk about, even as a wider society. And then if you then break it down into communities, within those communities, and involving lots of other people. For example, the faith communities, the sort of the children, we still don't have the children's voices in this community. I tried and I didn't get to talk to children directly, so therefore their experiences were shared from their mother's perspective.
Yeah.
Now I'm not going to give up. I'm hoping, because that's another area that very rarely spoken about,
Mm.
and the impact on children and their future. and how they themselves become adults. We need to talk
Yeah,
about that.
yeah, definitely.
So yeah, I'm going to
You
be
won't give
around for a
up.
while.
I love it. I know you won't give up. That's what I love. You know what? Next time we could talk, you will. You'll be there. You'll be getting to talk to those children. And it is your right voice of the child is because they are the next generation. You know, there's
Yes.
only so much we can do so much to help those who are already experiencing abuse or are coming out of abusive situations. But the children that are now living in those areas and living within those situations, they're the target that we also need to be focusing on to help them to guide them through
Mm.
what can only be described as just horrendous circumstances very often. And I'm not just talking violence, I'm talking, you know, like we said before about coercive control, the emotional abuse, the mental health impact, all of that. Yeah, it's massive. It is. But you are incredible. I'm very, I can't begin to tell you how grateful I am that you've come on this morning and had a chat. You've just covered so much in such a short space of time. You're amazing. Yeah.
Thank you, Lucy. I mean, it's wonderful to be asked to be talking about this. So grateful for you sort of reaching out and asking me to speak. And
Oh,
like I said, I can go on a lot to talk about and share this communities, women's experiences. So yeah, thank you for asking me to be here
oh,
today.
thank you. Thank you so much. And we will be back.
I look forward to that. I look forward to that.
Oh.
Well,